Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the In the Trenches podcast. This is your host, Cal Davenport, here as usual with Seth Root. And today we're going to be interviewing Amity Shales. She's the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, among them The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, The Greedy Hand, How Taxes Divide Americans, or Drive Americans Crazy, and a fantastic biography that both Seth and I have read of Calvin Coolidge, and then a newly released, she's edited the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge as well. And so we're going to be really focusing on Ms. Shales' knowledge of Calvin Coolidge. She's also she chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation and the Manhattan Institute's Hayek Book Prize, serves as a scholar at King's College, as a former member of the Wall Street Journal's editorial board, and she's published a weekly syndicated column for more than a decade, appearing in the Financial Times and then in Bloomberg. And we will be talking today about Calvin Coolidge's 4th of July speech on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Ms. Shales, thank you so much for being on the In the Trenches podcast.
I'm glad to be in the trenches. Thank you.
To begin with, can you sort of set the stage for Coolidge's famous 4th of July speech? There's a couple of birthdays of the United States and of Coolidge himself, of course, but beyond that, what was he trying to accomplish with this speech?
Just repeat that. July 4 was Coolidge's birthday, and that's kind of wonderful, isn't it? Only president born on the 4th of July. At this point, Coolidge is in his second term as U.S. president. And he's won, and this is a factor, a strong victory. He was the Republican candidate in 1924. There were 2 other parties, the Progressive Party, which was sort of a break-off group from both parties. And then there was the Democratic Party, and Coolidge didn't just win a plurality in that election. He won an absolute majority. He beat the other 2 parties combined. That's a strong mandate. He had support in Congress, not overwhelming support, but support. So you imagine a president in a second term. His first term, he didn't win. He happened into, because of a tragedy, the death of Harding. Coolidge's vice president had become president in 23, but now he's a different president because he's been elected in his own right. And that's important too. Here it is, a key landmark birthday, the inspiration of the Declaration, 1776. Now it's 1926, 150 years later. And it's an hour of great moment. In addition to that, there are a few other things about Coolidge that make him constitutional, a constitutional president as opposed to some others. One is who he was. He grew up in a state as much as in a nation. The state he happened to grow up in was Vermont. Vermont itself has a history of independence, right? It wasn't quite sure whether it wanted to join the Union, really didn't like New York. And Coolidge being born in 1872 is much closer to all that than we are. So you think of a man born in a small house, not a log cabin, but a very small house, living behind the store. Margaret Thatcher lived over the store. Coolidge, as a boy, lived behind the store where his father ran the store, in a hamlet that's hard to get to, an inaccessible hamlet. And what books? And no TV and no radio and no electricity. What did they have by way of entertainment? They had preachers, itinerant. They didn't even have their own preacher in Coolidge's town, Plymouth Notch, Vermont. It was too small. They couldn't afford one. And maybe also they didn't want one because the Coolidges were an inquiring family. So if you go and look at the books on the shelf of young Calvin, it's sort of something like on the shelf of young Abraham Lincoln, right? And as a boy, he read about heroes of Vermont and the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen and great generals. The Civil War is very recent. If you go to the cemetery in Plymouth, you see graves of those who made it back. There are other graves across the nation of people from Vermont served disproportionately in the Civil War on the northern side. So that's there too. This is all going on in Coolidge's mind. It happened particularly on the Constitution, which he writes in this autobiography, the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge. He read pretty young, age 13, and studied it and kept studying it. He said, I continued to go back to it. So he also read the Bible. Coolidge, people say, was Coolidge religious? You bet. He absorbed the Constitution and the Bible sort of osmotically. It was just in the water, in his environment, the way fluoride is in the water now. His grandmother taught Sunday school. She was a Northern Baptist. His school that he went to when he went away was a Northern Baptist school, not a Congregationalist school. Then he went to college. He went to a sort of default Congregationist college, Amherst College. And we think of our campuses today as charged and politicized, and campuses were always charged and politicized. Amherst was one of the breakoffs from Harvard. When people decided Harvard was too soft, they founded Amherst and Williams and places like that. And they were quite religious. Exactly which kind of religious, well, they fought over that. But let's say, as I say, default Congregationalist, definitely not Catholic. That's where he went to college. So that's Coolidge's formation, New England religious background. And like other presidents, he doesn't present as religious, but he thinks one, religion civilizes. And two, there's more to it than I thought. And he says that as much in this autobiography. Religion's more important than I might have thought one time when I was an ambitious young man. So that's kind of interesting. In his speaking habits, in his syntax, Coolidge is homiletic. He sounds like a preacher because he's heard approximately 1 million good short sermons. That was the culture. So you think of a Protestant, definitely Protestant culture, not too far from, say, Jonathan Edwards. The Coolidge family, when he married his lovely bride, Grace, they decided to be Congregationalist. She had formerly been, I think, Methodist. So think about that choice. It's a choice. They thought about it. They went to the Congregationalist church. And Grace was quite religious. Coolidge was hesitant about joining. The Coolidges are always, and Vermonters always put autonomy first, but eventually he joined a Congregationalist church in Washington. So all that's just like so much in the background. It's very interesting. He didn't need to be taught religion. It was just part of him. And when we get to 1926, what else is there to know? Two things, sticking to the religion. Recently, his son had died. So while he'd enjoyed a great victory, he was president of the United States, strong mandate. He'd enjoyed the greatest, or suffered rather, the greatest defeat, which is the death of a child. It's one of the worst things that can befall a human. Parents don't expect their children to die before them. His son, Calvin Jr., had died in 1924. And that had moved him yet closer, I think, to faith. And I'd like the readers to draw their own conclusions by looking at the autobiography. He does say, when the death of his son occurred, when Calvin died very suddenly of a blister on his toe that went septic in an era that just wasn't quite to the point where we had antibiotics, he said the joy of the presidency went to with Calvin. That didn't mean he wasn't an effective president. Didn't mean he wasn't an effective president. Like Lincoln, he continued to be president after the death of a child, but that certainly affected him and deepened his faith. And I believe, I hope I don't misquote, he says something to the effect that he should have joined a church earlier, and his own arguments against it had been, he thought, in retrospect, looking back, the counsel of the devil. I started to say about the Edwards Church, that church was inspired by Jonathan Edwards, their church in Northampton. So that's all mixed in, right? All that's in there, and it's who he is in his speaking style and his thoughts. Plenty of thought about churches and so on. Separately, just vis-a-vis the Constitution, Coolidge's interest, of course, he was an attorney. He went to Amherst for college, and then he joined a law firm. He didn't go to law school, which I think was important, because if you didn't go to law school at that time, you would naturally be closer to the common law in England than you would be to new trends in American law, such as those going strong at Harvard U Law School, even in Coolidge's time. So he read Blackstone and Cook, and he's more of a solicitor than a barrister. He's a natural counsel demeanor as a lawyer. He didn't like fights. He settled a lot because it saved his clients money. And he absorbed a lot of property law, which is very English and old American, as opposed to big civil rights law of the modern progressive kind or progressive law at that day. He read law at this firm, as Lincoln had. That is, he studied up while at the firm and then sat the bar in his state, which was Massachusetts. Different formation as a lawyer than that even of many of his friends who went to Columbia and Harvard. And I think my guess is Coolidge just ended up more like a country judge than like a civil rights litigator, if you want to draw caricature. And of course, that would be closer to the framers in the Constitution as well. Is that enough stage setting?
Absolutely. And as you've been describing this, I just see so many parallels, I think, to listeners know that we're here at in the trenches, we're huge fans of Abraham Lincoln, and I just see so many parallels here. Growing up in the country, being sort of a country lawyer, not having a lot to read, but the Bible available, and then of course being just very focused both on the Constitution and law, and also the Declaration itself. Can we dig into a little bit more into a couple of specific things related to the Declaration here? Coolidge states that the American belief in individual rights was not only advanced and more developed than elsewhere, but it was revolutionary. But he also talks about the American Revolution as not being a riotous insurrection, but a conservative revolution. So it's revolutionary, but it's not. But it's also conservative in a way, according to Coolidge. Can you maybe flesh out what does he mean by that? What are his views here? How does all of that come together in his thought?
I have searched the books and I have not found Coolidge quoting Burke, but his rhetoric recalls Burke. And to oversimplify Burke, and there'll be Burke scholars on your show all the time, Burke lived with / liked the American Revolution and disliked the French Revolution. Distinction. The French Revolution, well, that was a mob, and there was so much collateral damage, and perhaps the individual didn't prevail. A new French government, or rather successive French governments, prevailed, and France revolutioned ever since. And Coolidge, think of all the revolutions in France and changes in government in the 19th century. The U.S. would have argued, and probably Coolidge would have argued, we don't have a revolution. We're supporting the principles that England used to support. Just George III abuses them, George III, right? Such as individual rights. That's the oversimplification. I have not found, though it probably exists, a Coolidge analysis of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But what Coolidge would respect is the Magna Carta, an evolutionary, gradual kind of law, a law that's settled locally. Coolidge gave a wonderful speech at Westfield in a tumultuous progressive time in the 19s after World War I, where he quotes a story in the town where the citizens are being asked to back the new Constitution, which came after the Declaration. And this would be then in the period of Shays' Rebellion and so on, right? Massachusetts was in an uproar, or the Whiskey Rebellion. And in that speech, the character he quotes, whose name I believe is Smith, said back in the day, this Constitution isn't perfect, but I'll take it. It's better than having the musket of death presented to my breast. That is, revolution is dangerous and not necessarily productive. Let's get together and agree to this Constitution. And what was flawed about, what were people saying was wrong about? Well, it was made by rich landed men for rich landed men. And what about us? We're little farmers. We don't have a lot of land, or we're tradesmen, have no land at all. Why is this for us? And the farmer says, well, I live next door to a rich man. It doesn't bother me. Actually, he protects the border pretty well, and that protects me. That is, America is not a culture of envy. Our polity is not built on envy. And Coolidge mentions that too. It's a very interesting speech because Coolidge gave it around the time of again, 1919. He was a new governor, and he gave it just days before the Boston police strike, which was a terrifying public sector strike, which, when there was a police strike, there was a crime wave and windows were broken and people lost their stores and people even died. And Coolidge called out the state guard and they reestablished order in Massachusetts, in Boston. And the poor policemen who went on strike illegally lost their jobs. So the very tough moment for Coolidge, who actually loved the policemen and whose vote he had got when he ran for office the year before. So he was hurting a constituency of his. And all this was in his mind. And he was saying law and order, including a constitution, is very, very important. And law doesn't have to be that perfect, but there's virtue alone in observing the rule of law and not violating laws. Subtle speech, and that was important in his formation. That comes straight from the UK, in my view. In Coolidge's period, they debated whether Dutch tradition was more important or English tradition. And you want to look at that long and hard, because sometimes by Dutch tradition, they meant a tradition of commerce, and Coolidge did respect a tradition of commerce. And also, well, sometimes Holland was more tolerant than England, wasn't it? Right. The reason that people came to the United States was fleeing intolerance. So from what we think of as the UK, from England and so on. So all that's in Coolidge's mind, and it's just quite proximate to him as a young governor, as a president, all the way through. Does that answer your question, or what else did I leave out?
I think you answered it, right, Cal?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's really important to highlight sort of the Dutch influence on, because so many people who had fled religious persecution coming to the United States in the first place had stayed under Dutch protection at one point or another. And to see sort of, I think that what this really does is help us to tie together the influence of both the British system and the Dutch system in this new country that was maybe more purely instituting these principles of liberty and that sort of thing in their constitution, and expressing those ideas in the Declaration, and how that is, so it's at the same time maybe preservation and revolution here. And it's just beautiful how Coolidge brings that together. Seth, you had some questions more specific to the... Sorry, go ahead.
I think you wanted to ask about individual rights too, though.
Yep, absolutely. I think that was Seth's next question.
No, so go ahead and ask that.
Yeah. Well, I actually, I think you were probably going back to a little bit to Cal's questions about what made the individual rights, this idea, so revolutionary, but at the same time so conservative. It being a conservative revolution, it seems like that's a paradox that Calvin Coolidge, when he says in this speech, this 4th of July speech. It seems like a paradox. And I guess what I wondered is how do you sort that out? From it being a conservative revolution on the one hand, but also it being revolutionary in that until 1776, no other no other society based its government on natural rights, individual rights, and such, and the idea that all men are created equal. So, do you have an answer to that, in as far as how to sort this out, in this paradox, sort of way?
I think it's only a paradox now when we say liberal means left. That's why we don't use the word liberal too much. I'd rather say progressive, right? Certainly there was a tradition of individual rights in the UK, even though there was a sovereign, and the sovereign was also a servant. So that part of the UK he took with him. And you can't continue this discussion without mentioning faith. We're all equal in God's eyes. That was the basis of the Lutheran Revolution. They were certainly not going to be ruled by the church, and certainly not by a monarch. We're equal in God's eyes, and there's only limited authority of governments to make law. Coolidge said, "Men do not make laws, they do but discover them." That is, legislatures in their imperfect wisdom fumble towards principles that already existed. And without faith, we wouldn't have the United States. Before the United States and its laws written by a bunch of men, century and a half before, there were other laws. He suggests that repeatedly, and not just in the inspiration of the Declaration speech.
Gotcha. One thing that he did talk about too is the idea of authority comes from the consent of the governed, and not the other way around. And this he talks about repeatedly throughout, not just the speech, but I'm assuming in other speeches as well. And I was wondering, did Coolidge depart from others in his time, when it comes to this idea of consent of the governed, or do you think that the majority of the people agreed with Coolidge on this idea?
Well, certainly they believed historically in the United States, and the consent of the government, the consent of the states, right? States' rights versus the federal government. Coolidge was a progressive when he was in state government. And one reason for that was he was immature, right? You think of it that way. He was less of a progressive as president. He was caught up in a progressive party, the party of Theodore Roosevelt, and a progressive state that would be Massachusetts. And they were progressive. They passed all kind of expert laws, governing minutiae such as how a movie theater hires and what hours it's open. Right. But he observed the progressive experiment, and two things happened. One is it went national instead of being in state government. Right. And the other is he realized that the progressive experiment had silly, perverse results. Prohibition was a progressive experiment. Right. Led by a certain kind of conservative, the blue stocking. Alcohol can ruin your life, but maybe the federal government can't regulate that. He watched it. It was a real pain to regulate, to enforce prohibition. And it was creepy. You think of, when we had prohibition, of course, crime flourished, speakeasies, Al Capone. And guess who has to police that? The Treasury? The Coast Guard? Getting Al Capone was an unattractive exercise. We went, through the income tax, another creepy new bureaucracy, right? The forerunner to the IRS. Coolidge observed all that, and Andrew Mellon at Treasury had to pay for policing the border, so that liquor wouldn't be snuck in on primitive speedboats, and it cost money, and it was silly, and people shouldn't drink, but probably they should decide not to drink themselves, not drink just because the law from somewhere far away, Washington, told them not to. So he, as president, he grew up. He decided progressivism was a challenge. He really didn't like Louis Brandeis. Coolidge is the progressive justice from Massachusetts. Coolidge was a very a diplomatic politician. He didn't say somebody else is bad. He didn't believe in that. So I scoured the world to find negative campaigning by Coolidge, and I could scarcely find it. And he explains why he wouldn't negative campaign in this wonderful book, the autobiography. But he did say something about Brandeis. He said Brandeis, in a letter, he said Brandeis isn't safe. He used that word. He meant safe for the Republican Party and what we believe in. And he observed Theodore Roosevelt do terrible damage to his party. Coolidge was a party man by splitting it and giving an election to the Democrats, to Woodrow Wilson, because Wilson wouldn't won if Theodore Roosevelt wouldn't have won if Theodore Roosevelt hadn't been challenging his own party with the Bull Moose. So Coolidge thought this is selfish, and progressivism gives authority to experts. And I'm not sure experts always know. He repeats that, right? The authority should rest with the individual. So some of Coolidge's writing is just political, not hypocritical, but definitely political. And but if you look at it as you go along, you'll see a man becomes disillusioned with progressivism, certainly at the Washington level, and increasingly even maybe at the state level, and places more faith in the individual. What Coolidge knew, which is very interesting to trace back to Europe as well, is he understood that if you get up and say you're for liberty as a politician, it sounds great. And then you have to count how many seconds liberty for all holds before the situation devolves into competition among interest groups who say they're there in the name of liberty. And that just always happens. The French Revolution is for liberty. No, it's for a certain kind of person, and not for another kind of person who loses his property. And there are interest groups. And that's the great tragedy of the political process of political evolution. And he was keenly aware of that. I was just reading Bastiat, the French philosopher, classical liberals' letters to Cobden, the English free trader, Richard Cobden. And Bastiat went to some meeting or other of business people, like Chamber of Commerce type meeting. And he hoped that they would all agree to something like the League for Liberty. And instead, the group wanted to call it the League for the Reversal of Certain Taxes. And he wrote kind of grumblingly, Bastiat did, to Cobden, I really don't like this. That is way too disappointing. Let's stand for a general principle, classical liberty, not revolutionary Frenchy liberty. And these people just, all they cared about were their two issues. And here he sounds like Burke as well. So Bastiat does. Coolidge was just acutely aware of that. You start with a principle, and very soon it all decays into an interest group fight, whatever reform you lead, and that makes reform more dangerous.
Ms. Schlaze, you mentioned earlier about Coolidge really worried about the attacks against the individual, and this made me think of a Coolidge quote that he makes in his 4th of July speech. He says, "It is not so much then for the purpose of undertaking to proclaim new theories and principles that this annual celebration is maintained, but rather to reaffirm and reestablish old theories and principles which time and unerring logic of events have demonstrated to be sound." It sounds like he was pushing back against these ideas against the individual. Is that what sort of the thrust of this whole 4th of July speech sort of is to maintain these ideas of individual liberty and justice and equality under the law? Is that what you sort of see in this here speech?
Well, there are two things in the speech. One is his respect for faith, which we can get to, but the other is that, yes. Nope, there are three. There's also civil rights. But he has this famous phrase, and listen for the inversion. Only a person who had studied Latin or Greek or another inflected language would talk this way in American. He said, about the Declaration, there's a finality that is exceedingly restful. It's often asserted the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, new thoughts, new experiences, which have given us great advance over the people of the past of that day. And we got to be modern. Now I'm paraphrasing, but that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. That is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. That's an amazing statement to make to progressives who are busy calibrating how prohibition should be enforced, right? And it's interesting that he plays with the idea of progress here. It's a little bit of a jab at progressives, right? Because he's redefining progress or recapturing the original meaning of progress. And he goes on sort of aggressively in the speech. If anyone wishes to deny the truth of the propositions I just mentioned, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward to the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Oh, he's attacking progressives here. And why is he doing it? As I mentioned before, he's confident. It's a brave thing to do. You think of all the other things going on in the 20s, right? So the progressives are growing. Maybe they'll win another election. They actually did, right? In the 30s. Maybe I'm finished. Maybe my old-fashioned view is finished, but I'm going to lay it out just in case. That's what he's doing here. And the revolution, what he does is he bolsters his case by saying the revolutionary fathers were on my side. And then he says, you know, what were they standing on? The righteous authority of the Almighty. That is, the framers weren't the gods. They were operating in the spirit of the true God. Pretty interesting, right? Humility is a big part of it.
And it seems to go right into his what you were talking about his religious, convictions and such, and all. I know you said we could get in deeper when asking about religion in this case. How does this speech kind of get into the religious aspect of this?
Well, it's a period that's fairly successful, right? I won't say materialistic, that's a mean word, but Coolidge did. So you get a car, you get a radio, you get electricity, you go joyriding on Sunday instead of going to church. All this is happening, right? Coolidge's went to church. They made Charles Lindbergh go to church with them when he visited them. You sort of think tech people, they get a pass on church, right? Oh, he's a tech person. He's wearing a black shirt, right? Maybe he's rich. Maybe he had an IPO, right? Maybe he worked in Silicon Valley. He's not a church type. That's what Lindbergh was in the day. He was a sort of hero of almost like a general who conquers. That's what Lindbergh was. He'd flown over the Atlantic, technological break. And the Coolidges dragged this young man, Charles Lindbergh, to church with them when he visits the president. I think that's interesting, right? He believed not only in faith, but also in observance. Oh, kind of interesting, right? And he believed, and you can hear it in this speech, that the U.S. would not survive without religion. And we need religion to handle materialism or vanity, if you think today of the different ways we can be vain. True sanctimony is service, not showing off how good you are, I mean, it would be fun to talk to Coolidge about sanctimony. He suffered from sanctimony himself, and he thought a lot about it. I want to say something about this speech that tells you all you need to know. This is a speech about the 4th of July. Coolidge was born on the 4th of July. He was celebrating an event on the 4th of July. When did Coolidge give this speech? On July 5. Why is that? Because the 4th of July fell on a Sunday. Sunday is the day of observance, not the day of politics. I find that hilarious. I don't know who made that decision or how. It would make a great dissertation. Someone's going to find out more about this speech. Was it his hosts at Philadelphia? Was it Coolidge himself? But the speech about the 4th of July was delivered on July 5.
I think that's a wonderful detail. It's just there's so much talk in progressive circles about the idea of the separation of church and state, and I think we see what that idea, not written in the Declaration or in the Constitution, but what that idea means when properly understood in Coolidge's action here. And I think that's a wonderful note for us to end on. Amity Shales, thank you so much for coming on the program and giving us the context to understand Coolidge's thought and what he was saying in the speech. We'll post a link in on our page and in the show notes for people to read the speech with all of this context in mind.
Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
What's important about Coolidge philosophy is how it played out in policy as well. Coolidge thought too much taxation impinged upon the individual. And so he led a tax cut campaign. Was there a utilitarian Reaganite aspect to tax cutting under Coolidge? You bet. There was a progressive philosophy to the tax cuts, which is if you cut the rate, the government might get more money because people would be happy they were paying lower taxes and might work more. And overall, the government would get at least more money than it was expecting by the static math. And that turned out to be true. And Coolidge was very proud of the utilitarian tax cuts he supervised, forced through, led like a general with Andrew Mellon, his colonel, his fellow general, right? His team of rivals. But Coolidge was quite careful always to say there's a second reason to cut taxes, which is too much taxation is immoral. So he made the moral case for tax cuts. The politicians didn't usually bother with that. They talked about what works and what doesn't. And today in economics, when we talk about economics, it's often a discussion. If you leave a boy alone in a room with a cookie, will he eat it? Right? What kind of boy is he? What incentive can you give him not to eat the cookie when he's alone after you told him not to eat it? That is, economics turns into behavioralism of a social sciencey variety and a sort of isn't that neat attitude. Isn't it neat? If you give families a child credit, they can have one more child, maybe. Coolidge despised that isn't it neat micromanagement of the individual soul. He just said too much taxation gets in people's ways. America is a free country. Let's keep it free by not hampering, enslaving, shackling Americans with over taxation because their souls need to be free. It's a different argument, and he was not uncomfortable making it. That's very interesting. And the policy worked. On the utilitarian level, the economy did grow when they cut the taxes. America did gain primacy in the world, or rather firm up its primacy in the world because of our tax policy in the 1920s. England went the other way, and England went towards decline. But the moral component was there too, and people liked it and understood it and supported him. And they came to trust the government because the government was less random, progressive, and intrusive under Coolidge. So what a display, what a tour de force by Coolidge. That's the main thing. It's not, he didn't just have this philosophy. A lot of presidents had the philosophy. He also executed on it. that's important for us to know.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. But for our listeners, please check out Michelle's biography of Coolidge, just entitled Coolidge, and also the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge, which she edited. Thank you so much for being on our program, and thanks everyone for listening.